thank you all for coming. I consider this my official book launch, and I know that retirement and all this stuff that comes with it is not an easy or a sexy subject to talk about, but I hope I can make that journey a little easier for you. It's interesting. Someone was talking before the show, and they said, well, all these boomers are here because, this is happening to all of us. So it is interesting. I have to say that before I started to write either book, I looked around at what was out there in terms of retirement books, and it's as if the only thing you need is money. Nobody talks, every other book is about, have you started saving your money you made babysitting or doing your newspaper route? You should save that for retirement. And everything was about, oh God, you're 30, you haven't saved yet, you're 40, what's wrong with you? So I said, there's more to retirement than just having enough money. There's an emotional, psychological change that we go through, and the wisdom is that people don't like change, but sometimes you can't help it, and retirement is change. So I have to say a few things first. I know that many couples are doing very well in retirement. They're finding all kinds of interests and things that they want to do together and things that they can do apart. And if you or someone you know is having a great retirement, more power to them, and that's what we all want. That's the goal we should all be seeking. Also, I'm aware that due to illness or death, some couples never even get to retirement. And I know that it's painful to talk about that in front of these people, when you can't complain about, oh God, if only she would do this, if only he would do that, if the other person has lost a partner. But these are issues. Again, people start all over, they reinvent themselves, and I want to at least tell you that I sympathize with people who don't have a partner. But I know from hundreds of people that I've talked to that living with resentment and anger and regret is no fun. And there are many, many couples in retirement and facing retirement that are confronting those issues. And again, not everybody has them, but the ones that do have the issues, I think make it worthwhile to discuss the subject. Most of the stories and the solutions in Too Much Togetherness are based on interviews that I did with married couples, but the solutions really apply to any couples who live together, same-sex domestic partners, people who live together, people who are very close with someone. Maybe they're not living in the same house, but they have a relationship. And I think all these people have to think about what happens to their lives when they don't have the distraction of a job, a family, and of other responsibilities, and how they can be prepared for this major change in their life. And also, Neil mentioned that I had the first feminist radio program in the country, and I see the issues of how we live in retirement as a really important feminist issue. I think women in retirement have to stand up for themselves as much now as they did when they were trying to break into careers in a rather unwelcoming environment. And changing and challenging the status quo of retirement can be as complicated as people trying to push through the glass ceiling. There's not anybody there who's going to help you. You can't look at what your parents did and say, oh, I want a retirement like that. Sometimes you're going to find that people don't approve of the way you're living your retirement. They say, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And we have to understand that we're going through changes. We are a generation of change, and we're not the people who came before us, and we're not necessarily going to get the support that we got in other changes in our life. So having no role models in the 21st century, no support system, no rules, again, makes it more complicated to figure out how you're going to deal with retirement. So despite this lack of instruction, this lack of mentoring, men and women approaching retirement have lived through more social change in the last 50 years than probably happened in the last 5,000 years. Our childhoods were different from those before us. Our teenage years were studied and overstudied and studied again, and psychologists and sociologists and everybody was telling us, this is what teenagers are, this is what teenagers aren't. And then when we got to our adult lives, we found that we were unique in different ways. We didn't necessarily stay with the career that we started out with. We didn't necessarily stay with the partner we started out with. There were changes in sexual attitudes, changes in approaches to problems, all kinds of important social changes going on in the country that many people participated in. And so we shouldn't be a generation that's afraid to change. It's out there, there's so much to do, and change doesn't have to be scary. But when you're approaching retirement and you're living in a situation where neither partner has a job and has no place where they're committed to outside the house, it becomes a problem. And I've been thinking about the issues of couple in retirement for a long time, and I started asking everybody I knew and people I didn't know, what are you doing for retirement? What are your plans for retirement? And one day I was talking to a man who was cutting my hair, and I told him about the book I was writing. He said, you know, the woman who was just here before me had really interesting things to say. She said her husband was retired, and so was she. And she said, you know, I really love my husband, but now when I drive down the street and I see his car in the driveway, I just want to keep on going. So, you know, it's not that unusual an issue. I met a couple. The woman told me this, and she said it right in front of her husband. She said, you know, my husband had a very successful career, and I was a very busy volunteer. I had done a lot of volunteer work in my life. And she said on Friday night there was a big retirement party, and there was cake and speeches, and everybody was very excited about it and wished him well and everything. And on Monday morning I'm getting dressed, and he comes into the room and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, it's Monday. It's my tennis day. And he said, but I retired. So here was all this build-up, everything, and they had never had a conversation about what did this mean for our lives, you know. So he retired. So yes, and you know, and even people who think that they have really good communication with their partner are finding over and over again that sometimes there's things that are just not said and should be said. So that's the problem. One partner assumes the world has changed, the other doesn't. And that's the problem of too much togetherness. How are we supposed to function in an entirely new stage of life when we haven't prepared and we never thought we would have to talk about how we would spend our time in retirement? So one of the things I looked at, and I've mentioned before, is assumptions. Each partner assumes he or she knows what the other one really wants, whether or not it is put in words. In the worst case, he assumes that she wants to give up her friends and activities and be with him all the time. She assumes he will be fine on his own every day. This is where the problem begins. Neither partner has talked about the issues, and both end up unhappy, guilty, and confused as to how do they get where they were without a set of directions to tell them how they're supposed to behave. It is not your father's retirement, but how are we supposed to adjust? You would think that after 30 or 40 years of being together, raising kids, going through all the ups and downs of modern life together, that retirement would be easy. But for many people, it is not. Couples who've negotiated a lifetime of difficult decisions often find there's a breakdown when they have to face post-career issues. People who feel they've spent a lifetime compromising may feel that they don't want to give up one more time, and we end up with a number of gray divorces. In fact, the greatest number of divorces today are people who've been married more than 20 years. Now, some of this confusion has to do with the uncertainty of what each day will bring without the structure of a job or a community or purpose. But also, people are anxious about health, about money, about frailty, and about aging, and who's going to take care of them when the need arises. And nobody wants to talk about it. You should know that this is not a wholly American problem. Retirees all over the world are finding it difficult to negotiate the new rules when they feel young and still able to contribute to society. I talked with a woman in India who'd been forced by law to retire at 60. She was a research scientist, and she was working for a state-run lab, and she had to leave her job because the law was 60. You're out here. But she told me she found a way to sneak in at night and go into the lab and continuing work on her research, even though she had been considered too old by her employers. In Japan, it's even worse. There, psychiatrists have found themselves treating a new disease called retired husband syndrome. Doctors found that wives of retired Japanese husbands were showing up in their offices with rashes, ulcers, dizziness, and other signs of stress. And they said this applies to almost 60% of the wives of retired husbands. I'm not making this up. These are women who are getting sick because they turn out to be suffering from stress of having a husband at home who doesn't know what to do with himself. And he becomes bossy or needy or both. And Japanese women have used a term that means wet leaves to describe their husbands. Because we all know what it's like to walk through a pile of wet leaves and they keep clinging to you and you keep pulling them off and they're clinging to you. And they really have done this. So Japanese men, and I don't know how much of it is true and how much of it is myth, but supposedly Japanese men, work long hours, they have dinner at the office, they go out drinking after work, and they barely really even know their wives and hardly at all know their children. So that their whole life, their whole social network has been their job, and when they don't have a job, they're virtually without friends. So it also seems to be that Japanese men don't know how to take care of themselves. Many of them went straight from having a mother to having a wife to cook and clean for them, so he's at another disadvantage. So luckily, these same therapists who have helped us who have examined and found out that there's this retired husband syndrome, they have set up special therapy groups for men so they can learn how to take care of themselves and how to treat their wives better and to work on a more egalitarian relationship. And if you think this is a rare occurrence, there are more than 3,000 of these members groups in Japan today. Well, back here things are different, but they're not always better. It's still a matter of recognizing that both partners in a couple are dealing with a new stage of life, and the lack of role models or rules have left us pretty much on our own. Each of us must break through the self-imposed barriers and look at our relationships and our future with a new vision and new possibilities. We do have choices as to how we spend our retirement years, so let's choose a future of new and exciting possibilities. As boomer women, again, the feminist in me, I discovered that many of us find ourselves caught between the Bettys, Betty Crocker and Betty Friedan. We're confronting the expectations of the last generation, and we're looking at how it influences us today and what we can do in the future. We still have time to do it right, as long as we are conscious of what is right for us and we keep an open mind. It's possible to redefine our partnerships now so that we too can succeed in retirement. I know it's common for people to read from their books.